Andy Kaplan is one of the best known and highly respected executives in the international TV business. As head of Sony Pictures Television's worldwide networks, Andy was instrumental in building a global channel operation for Sony, experience he now leverages at KC Global Media Entertainment, the company he co-founded and which operates pay TV channels across Asia. Andy talks about starting out with Norman Lear, why there's still life in the linear channels business model, and how securing Indian cricket rights completely bowled him over. Enjoy. Hi Andy, welcome to the pod.
Thanks, Danny. Great to be here.
Your career has been associated over many years with India. And of course, one of the most important aspects of Indian life is cricket. So I wondered how much of the world of cricket had been imbued by you and had influenced you. And so I have a question for you.
Sure.
In cricket, there are 11 ways that a batsman can be dismissed. And I wondered if you could name, let's say, 4 of them.
Or maybe even just one of them. That's a good question. You know, certainly at the beginning of the whole experience, I knew nothing about cricket other than I probably could have identified a cricket bat if I had to. But over the many years, I at least got to the point where I could watch a game and enjoy it, know enough that was going on to enjoy it and even get enthusiastic about a good match. Well, how about one? How about just poor sportsmanship? Is that too generic? Is that too broad?
Let's say that the cricket, it was just purely business. It was just business for you.
Yeah.
And that was...
it was very much business, yeah.
I guess if your younger self had been told by your older self that India and cricket was going to be a big part of your professional life when you started out in the business, that would have been quite a surprise to your younger self.
Sure. Well, it would have been a surprise in a lot of ways, which I suppose we'll talk about. But I started, it's a little bit cliche, I started in the mailroom. My first job out of college was in the mailroom at Embassy Communications, which was the company that was owned by Norman Lear and Jerry Parencio and run by Alan Horn. And I got a job in the mailroom and just kind of worked my way up the ladder. There were twists and turns in between, but that's kind of, you know, sort of how it started. I didn't know which direction I wanted to go. I kind of had the idea that I wanted to be a writer, but I quickly discovered, I think, that I didn't want to be a starving writer. So if that was going to be a necessity of the process, I sort of turned my attentions in other directions and then actually decided that maybe I would go to law school and sort of re-enter the business from that sort of a standpoint. As it happens, I didn't do that at the last minute. I got offered a job at the same company where I was in the mailroom as sort of a junior sales executive, and I just decided I would take that opportunity, see if it worked out, and if it did, great, and if it didn't, I could always go back to law school later on, and never did, never had to, never did.
And was that the heyday? I mean, Norman Lear and Embassy were responsible for some of the most iconic TV shows. And so that must have been a massively exciting and interesting time to be there.
It really was. And in some ways, I sort of always felt like I missed a little of it. I started there at the company in 1982, which was already 10 years after All in the Family and the Jeffersons and Good Times and Maude and One Day at a Time. So I started in 1982 and they sold the company to Coca-Cola in the middle of 1985. So there was sort of another 3 years of what was a very long and successful run for that company. And then it became part of Columbia Pictures Television, which was also at that time owned by Coca-Cola and sort of got folded into their legacy.
People have spoken about the time that Sony then came in the early 1990s, and you were obviously there at the company as well.
Yeah.
Was there much of an impact? How did things change by having Sony there after the previous regime, which had been quite an interesting one in its own right?
I think Sony taking over the company, there were positives and negatives about it. I mean, first of all, there was a lot of conversation about being bought by a Japanese company and what that meant. And the most significant thing that it meant that may or may not have been relevant in the future was the fact that a lot of the companies were dabbling with, or not even dabbling with, but buying US networks. And because of the foreign ownership restrictions, Sony was somewhat limited in their ability to do something like that if they were of a mind to do it. I don't know that they ever would have really been of a mind to do it, because there was always, in some way or another, a question about their real commitment to the business. When they bought the company, the thesis was that it was going to be the grand combining of electronics, consumer electronics, and content. And then, as we know, over time, a roller coaster of execution, ups and downs, and it sort of never really got to fruition. And so as managements came and went and changed, and their tolerance for the economic ups and downs of the movie business was always a challenge, and their tolerance for the media presence, more usually the movie business than the television business, always kind of just created an odd environment to work under, especially as we were comparing ourselves to some of the other studios, which had big companies behind them and big strategic commitments towards pursuing the future.
It's fascinating, isn't it, when you talk about that vision for combining consumer electronics and content, and then you read about the Sky Glass launch and what Sky are proposing to do by launching a consumer electronics product with a TV with a dedicated content offering built in, and you think to yourself, "Oh yeah, I've heard of that idea before somewhere. I can't quite put my finger on where I heard about that."
It's a little bit of the cycle of life. And remember, in between there for a minute and a half was Matsushita when they bought Universal, and I think we're going to try to do the same thing, but quickly turned tail and ran away when they realized the challenges and the capital allocation that was necessary to pursue those kinds of strategies.
Around about 2000, I think, you stepped out of the Sony world and the studio world and moved into more sort of digital operations, the internet 1.0, I guess. What were you thinking at that point, and did you learn really fascinating things by having made that move at that time?
Many people ask me, what were you thinking? So it's a good question all these years later. I think there's learnings from everything we do, and there certainly were many learnings from all of that experience. It was a very interesting and heady time. It was, as you say, Internet 1.0 and the internet bubble. There was so much money coming into these new digital media companies, and we would all be getting phone calls all day long from headhunters trying to recruit us to go to do things. And in most cases, for far less money than we were making, but with the pot of gold of the equity that you would, stock options that would ultimately be worth tens of millions of dollars and so forth. I entertained a number of those kinds of situations, and there was this company, the Hollywood Stock Exchange, which I was familiar with because I knew the principals, and so the opportunity to go over and be the CEO, which was obviously something that I wanted to do from a career standpoint of a standalone business in the middle of all of this frothy times, was just something that was frankly, enticing. I would say my timing was pretty bad because I signed my contract to go over to the Hollywood Stock Exchange the day that the NASDAQ crashed in April of 2000 and went down 500 points. What we didn't know on that day was this the beginning of something much, much worse, or was this just a bad day? I guess I hoped it was just a bad day, and I signed my contract and I went through with the transition, and things just went from bad to worse for companies that hadn't raised enough capital to survive these sorts of things. And we spent the next 4 to 6 months just desperately trying to raise money in an environment where it was just not doable. And so never really got all that much opportunity to run the company and explore whether the vision of what the Hollywood Stock Exchange was or could be, could get to fruition, because we were just scrambling to keep the lights off. So it was very much a baptism of fire. I learned a tremendous amount. I'd spent most of my career at that point being part of a big company, which has great benefits to it, but also you don't necessarily get to see the entrepreneurial side of life. And when you're thrown into a situation where you're, overseeing 100 people, not 1,000 people, and you have to worry about paying the rent and make payroll and fundamental blocking and tackling kinds of things that you kind of never really have to deal with when you're at a studio and those things are sort of taken care of for you, was eye-opening and exciting and frightening, and went through a whole raft of those emotions in a very truncated period of time, because we sort of ran out of money by the end of that year, and that was sort of the end of it. And I've thought about it a lot over it's 20 years ago now. If I had it to do over again, would I? And there's a whole lot of pros and cons about it, but I would say that now in my stage of life I'm in, which is in a very entrepreneurial situation, many of the lessons that I learned about being an entrepreneur and running entrepreneurial companies came from that short but very intense experience. And so I think they're all just notches on the belt, arrows in the quiver, whatever metaphor you want to use. And it all goes into the experience and the evolution of who you become.
And then you returned after a couple of years to Sony Pictures, and this time focusing on the international channels business.
It was an unexpected thing. I was sort of in that phase after the Hollywood Stock Exchange where I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do next, and did I want to work at a big company, a big studio, or a small one, and so forth. And, my first part of my time at Sony, the first 15 years, was spent mostly in the content production and distribution parts of the business, and even primarily the US parts of those vision. I was involved, sort of tangentially in things happening internationally and so forth, including the strategic decision that had been made to start investing in the international channels business as a sort of a third leg of the stool for Sony Pictures, the movie business, the movie content business, the television content business, and then the broadcasting business. I think that the feeling was that we'd sort of missed it in the US, but it was open field running internationally. It was all brand new. Satellite technology was just getting started, and it was early days. And so that the barriers to entry were low, and we had as good or better in terms of our library assets and content assets as anybody else, as any of the competition. And so the decision was to, dip the toe into the water. And that was before I left to go run the Hollywood Stock Exchange. But those initiatives had carried on, and then I got a call from our old friend and your old boss and my old colleague, Michael Grinton. And he said, do you want to come help with these businesses? And I think we had the channel in Asia, and I think we were in Latin America, and India was a few years into it and so forth. And they were making a little bit of money, but not as much as some of the competitors. But there was ambition there to grow these businesses, to deploy capital, and to try to turn them into a significant sort of third pillar of the company. And I thought it was just a really interesting, again, somewhat surprising, not that I didn't know these businesses, but I'd never run businesses like these firsthand. But obviously Michael thought that I could, figure it out. And the other irony of it, of course, was I was not one who was really all that interested in traveling internationally. I had been to London. I'd been to the south of France. And like most U.S. executives at the time, that was the definition of international. And those were all places we didn't have channels. We had channels in all of the other places that nobody had ever gone to, including India. But it was kind of a blank slate. It was take the businesses that we have and make them better and get us into new places, and good luck. And so I took the mandate, and 16 years later, it worked out pretty well. We built up a pretty substantial and significantly profit contributing business. And I think we checked a lot of the boxes and fulfilled a lot of the mission of becoming a third leg of the stool, as I said.
And within the overall business, India, I guess, was a very significant part. In fact, one got the impression that it was of such a significance, not only to Sony Pictures Television, but the whole of Sony Pictures Entertainment in terms of the degree of profitability that it achieved.
Well, it became almost disproportionately significant. Like in the content side of the world, you never know where your next hit's coming from. And sometimes in business, you don't know where your next hit's coming from. The investment into India, in many cases, it was not that different than the investment into Southeast Asia or Latin America. But what was different was two things. One, those were other businesses were pay TV channel investments, which meant by definition a relatively limited audience because you were only exposed to a number of people who had cable or satellite boxes in their homes, which at those periods of time was a pretty low percentage. But in India, it was effectively a broadcast model, which meant broad, which meant an audience out to as many people as you could get to. And the fact that India had so many people, probably at that time, I'm going to say 700 million people and now 1.4 billion people, just staggering numbers of eyeballs, even with lower GDP and lower macroeconomic metrics, but just the sheer size and the numbers were going to give you in success a bigger business. And that's what happened. The other thing that happened was going back to the internet 1.0 and the frothiness in the world and the NASDAQ at an all-time high before it crashed. A lot of companies were raising capital and a lot of companies were going public. And in the short 4-year period of the existence of that business up to 2000, they had gone out and gotten a valuation of $2 billion from some investors who put some money into it. Even though they sold a small piece, it was just a irrationally staggering valuation in comparison to the rest of the company. But over time, the India business just continued to grow and grow and grow. And the profitability, the profit contribution to the overall of Sony Pictures probably at various times was 25 or 30% of the whole company. And less than 10 executives from the company had ever been to the Indian operation. And not many more could probably even point to it on the map. And yet here was this tremendous contribution to the top and the bottom line of the company, a company that to its core and its DNA was first and foremost a movie company, and then secondarily a TV production company, and then after that, a broadcasting company. So it was a strange sort of a thing. It got a lot of people's time and energy because the numbers started to just get so significant. It just wasn't something you could keep your head down and be under the radar on. And so it was exciting, but it was also a little bit challenging because it was a little bit of a square peg in a round hole.
One of the initiatives that happened under your watch was the move into original production as well for the networks business. So in a way, that was going back to your roots to some extent.
We were businesses and networks with, again, always the asterisk or the exception of India, which was just a kind of a completely different kind of operation, where the content that we were putting on our networks was just content we were licensing from studios and suppliers. And that's great. And you can get decent ratings if you pick the right programs and you schedule them properly. But there's a little bit of a ceiling on it in terms of how far you can go with just acquired programming. And so the next move, whether you were just talking about how TV stations had been doing it forever or cable networks or whatever, was to get into original content because the investment was higher, but you usually drove better ratings as a result of it. You could customize it for your audience in a way that just importing US content was never going to be the same. We always knew local is where it's at. People want to see themselves in their programs, and they're more interested in it. Their local stars are what people want to see. And so as a result, you spend more, but you do better with the ratings. And you also start to build a library, which you can then, in certain cases, export and license out to other people. So there's a lot of good reasons to do it. And we did probably more of it in India than anywhere else, because India wasn't a business based on acquiring programming. It was a business based on creating and commissioning in the fledgling and building up Indian marketplace. But we did start with a bunch of formats international formats that had shown to be exportable and successful in a lot of places. We did American Idol, we did Indian Idol, we did Betty LaFea, which we called Jossie. We weren't the first to do Millionaire. We were the second to do Millionaire. Star had done Millionaire successfully for a few years, and then it had gone off the air. And then we went and said, let's try that again. Let's put, Amitabh Bachchan in it. And it was a tremendous hit for us it's still on the air there. They're still having great success, 15 years later with that. But then we also knew that we were going to have to spend more time and more money on truly originally created and developed shows with truly local stories, and more money on the scripted side of the business, which we did. And we weren't the only ones doing it, but we were certainly one of the innovators in it, which ultimately laid the foundation for what's now become a pretty important creative industry in India in particular, with the streamers, all of whom have taken what our industry at that time had built and put in place, including the creators, and now continue to do more of that, but with much, much, much higher budgets. And so you get a whole different kind of a product.
So having then finished for the second time at Sony, you now set up KC Global Media Entertainment. And it's interesting because you've invested in the linear channels business, particularly in connection with some of the channels that you oversaw on the Sony side. And Sony, it seems, along with a number of other traditional, what you might call legacy media businesses, seem to be stepping away from the linear channel model. And you're moving into that linear channel model. So you see something there, whether that's in Asia specifically or just in general, that the death of the linear channel has been somewhat exaggerated. So it'd be great to hear more about your current business and also your thoughts on the role that linear is going to play, whether specifically in Asia or just in general.
The other studios have sort of pivoted to their own and operated SVOD services and wanting to put their capital there and invest there. Sony's strategy is slightly different. They're not in the platform business. They want to be the expression they use are arms dealers, and they want to be creators of content and distributors of content to all players and the highest bidder. And so the decision was to, for the most part, again, with the exception of India and the Game Show Network, which they own, which are both very, very profitable for them, to get out of those other businesses as just not part of what they see their strategy as going forward. And so over the last 3 years, they've been slowly but surely divesting of most of those other businesses. And so obviously, as someone who built these businesses and knowing them so well, I was interested in seeing if there would be opportunities to pick them up, especially in places where we thought that there was still opportunity to be had. And in particular, and with my partner, George Chin, who ran the Asia Pacific region for me at Sony, we felt like there was unfinished business to be done in the Southeast Asia business. We knew those markets very well. George certainly knows them better than anybody. He's got deep relationships in the markets. We knew the businesses. And what we found was, again, kind of going back to the entrepreneurial side of the conversation, is that there are things that entrepreneurs can do that big companies can't do, and there are things that big companies can't do that entrepreneurs can do. And companies that are situated with the right ownership and the right strategies, can do better and flourish. And sometimes they just don't belong in big companies. And, kind of going back to what I said, the square peg in the round hole, the third leg of the stool it was always going to be the third leg of the stool. It was never going to be part of the DNA of the company. And what we've been able to do, what George and I have been able to do, in the year and a half where we have owned the Southeast Asia business, we were able to find a way to make a deal with Sony to take those businesses on, is, I think, run them in a little bit more of an efficient and entrepreneurial way to be more effective and efficient and hopefully profitable, but also responsive to the marketplace. To answer your question about the linear channel business, and yes, I think the death and demise of the linear channel business has been a little bit overstated. Look, there's no question that viewing habits are changing, and that more and more share of viewing time and eyeball time is coming from the digital and over the top world. But linear television isn't going away any more than local TV stations are going away, any more than radio is going away. It doesn't mean it's not declining, but I think you have to figure out how slow or quickly the decline is coming. And you don't get the same answer in every part of the world, because every part of the world has a different evolutionary curve of their media landscape, which includes how penetrated or not penetrated pay TV viewership is. And in a lot of emerging markets, it's much less penetrated than in the more mature Western markets. And so that's one thing you have to factor in. You have to factor in the demographics of every country. A lot of these generations that are coming on now have grown up doing most of their media on their telephones and on their mobile phones, and will never subscribe to a cable box in their life. But at the same time, there's some markets and territories with much older demographics that will never be as facile with the newer technology. All of which is to say, Southeast Asia, in many parts of the markets, we think has a long and longer runway for linear television. And again, like I say, over time, it probably will decline a little bit, but we think there's a lot of opportunity from here to there. And I think there will be other places in other markets where the same opportunity exists. So it's a little bit of a contrarian view. It's certainly not the sexy conversation at parties. Oh, tell us about your pay TV linear channels in Asia. But we think there's some good work to be done there, some good content to be produced there, and hopefully we'll make a little bit of money along the way too.
What would you pick as a career highlight if you had to point to one particular moment or a deal or a show that you're associated with? Is there one that really stands out?
I think one of the things that I really love about my career is, and it certainly was more true in the first half than the second, was that I was a sort of a generalist, which meant that I got to get involved in all different aspects of the business and learn about all different aspects of the business. And I loved that. I didn't ever want to have to choose. But then as time went on and the opportunity to run these channel businesses came up, I did choose, and I went deep rather than wide. And that was a fantastic experience also. And so, to just sort of pick one thing out of a relatively, long period of time is tough. But we touched a little bit on the IPL, which was the Indian Premier League. In the Indian broadcasting, they say, or in media, they say there are two religions. There's Bollywood and there's cricket. And what we quickly realized with our mission and ambition to be a national broadcast network is that we had to be involved in both of those. And one of the earlier initiatives was starting a Bollywood movie channel, which turned out to be very successful. But then we knew we had to get into the sports business, and cricket in particular. And they had acquired some World Cup cricket rights and some other things. And then when the Indian Cricket League decided that they were going to start up this new tournament with 2020 cricket. I mean, already when I heard that, I'm thinking, what? I don't know what you're talking about. Isn't cricket 5 days long or 1 day long, and there's a tea break and all of those cliches about it that are very well earned? And now they're saying, no, 2020, it's more like baseball, and it's going to be 3 hours long, and all that. It was a pretty compelling pitch, especially not to me, but to the people in the company who understood cricket and all of the aspects of what it was going to be. And it was very innovative, and it was something that had never been done before. And they were looking for a national broadcaster to pay them a lot of money for the rights, but also to help them launch this business and this tournament and this league for the long run. So we got involved, and it was really hard and it was really complicated because, one, we didn't know if it was going to work, but the numbers were, by comparison to anything else we'd ever done in the channel business anywhere in the world, there were a lot of zeros. And we were not Fox and News Corp and Murdoch and going out and spending billions of dollars for the NFL because the guy at the top of the company was telling the organization to go do that and spend that kind of money, and it was going to change the organization. This was a bottom-up initiative where we ultimately had to justify why we wanted to spend all this money, and then ultimately had to sell that in to the corporate guys in Tokyo at the very top of the company who barely knew where India was, who barely knew they had a business there, and barely knew what cricket was. And so it was so fraught with challenges on every level. But, the team all worked together, both in Los Angeles and Tokyo and in India, to try to put it together. And ultimately, we put together, and there's a lot of smoke and mirrors with this, but the Indian Cricket Board wanted a $1 billion announcement. They wanted to announce a $1 billion deal. And in truth and substance, what we ultimately ended up bidding wasn't $1 billion, but on its face and on the press release and how it was justified, it looked like it. And it was a really big deal. And one of the big lessons about it, aside from just getting it done, was it's as important to bet on and be prepared for success as it is to be prepared for failure. It's as or more important. You don't know where your successes are going to come from, but it can be just as bad to have a big success and not be prepared with how to deal with it and continue it. And so what happened was the league started, the games went on, the matches went on the air. It was a huge success. The ratings were so much bigger than anybody had imagined and expected. And the Cricket League had seller's remorse because we'd made a 10-year deal. And now they felt like they undersold it. And so they worked in every legal way they possibly could to undermine the contract and find ways around it. And so that was actually not a very pleasant time. But it was all born from success, which was all born from risk-taking, which was all born from just believing in an idea and being able to sell it in the organization. And I don't for a second want to sit here and say this was my idea or my vision. I was leading a team with a lot of really smart and creative and innovative people, but we got it done. And that IPL franchise now is one of the most valuable sports franchises in the world. And we were there at the beginning and started it. So I would have to say among a very blessed career of highlights, that was probably one of the big ones.
That's a pretty good one, I think, I have to say.
Because you're a cricket fan.
At this point in the podcast, I like to ask my guests for their lockdown film, book, music choice, and box set. So what would be your choices? If we start with film, what would be your all-time lockdown film?
Well, I was sort of thinking about the question, as you've asked many of your guests before. So taking the film first, almost 2 years of this lockdown, one of the things, of course, that was supposed to happen was that the new James Bond movie was supposed to come out 2 other times than when it's just come out recently. And so what I had done was I'd gone back to watch the other 4 Daniel Craig Bond films in anticipation. I was sort of studying up and reviewing for No Time to Die to come out. And when it didn't come out the 2 other times, I kind of had to do it more recently just to kind of remember. So I feel like I'm up to speed on that. On the TV side, two shows, both British sitcoms that I just thought were great and funny and heartwarming at the same time, which was a little bit of kind of comfort food in a strange sort of way for the lockdown. Was one called Catastrophe, which was on Amazon, Sharon Horgan, which I just thought was funny and smart and poignant and really enjoyed that. And another one that was sort of similar, but not, I'm not exactly sure where it aired in the UK. It's on Apple TV Plus here is a sitcom called Trying, kind of laugh out loud funny and, tear jerking and all that. So on the book side, sort of one of the other things that in the career that has meant a lot to me was my association with the 2 most successful game shows in U.S. history, Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy. I oversaw those shows for many, many, many years. And so, in the past year back or so, as Alex Trebek, who I'd gotten to know very well, had announced that he had cancer, and then he ultimately passed away. But before he did, he wrote an autobiography called The Answer Is, which I sort of dug into and really enjoyed because there was stuff about him I didn't know, and then there was, of course, stuff in the book that I had lived through. So I enjoyed that one as well. And then on the music side, I think something that came out of the pandemic and the lockdown was, a lot of feelings of nostalgia. I think a lot of your guests have talked about books and movies and so forth that they've gone back that held some sort of a nostalgia to them. And so I found myself listening to a lot of kind of music from when I was growing up in the 60s, but one in particular was a Sergio Mendes album called Equinox, which was sort of one of his early ones and famous ones, which was an album that I remember being a very young kid that my parents, played in the house on records, as they did back then, all the time. And it's just an album I always loved. And so that was kind of one of a bunch from that era that I kind of went back to kind of check in on, and in some of those darker lockdown pandemic hours.
Well, Andy Kaplan, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast. It's been a fascinating look at an incredible career. And as we've talked about earlier on the podcast, with the demise of linear TV being very much exaggerated, we'll look forward to more success for KC Global Media and see what the future holds.
Well, thanks, Danny. It was a pleasure to do this. I'm a big fan of the pod, and I hope you keep doing them. And yeah, we'll keep you posted on the overstated demise of linear television.